This is MATD1544, and we're going to look now at Unit 3, our inverse trigonometric functions. And in this recording, we're going to look at the inverse sine function, which we call arcsine. So we're going to look at the arcsine function. Now, if we look at our normal sine graph, just our normal sine graph that we just did all the drawings for in the previous recordings in the previous unit. Then we also did last semester functions and inverse functions. And we said last semester that if you now look at a vertical line, if you draw a vertical line through the graph, this is definitely a function. So sine is a function. But then we also said that if you draw a horizontal line and it intersects more than once, then it tells us that this function's inverse, the inverse function, will not be a function. The inverse of this function will not be a function. So arcsine cannot be a function if we take the normal sine function. That is what this horizontal line is showing us. So they had to make a plan. They had to come up with a plan because we want to work with the inverse function. Okay, and therefore they decided to restrict the sine function to minus pi over 2 to pi over 2. So only this part of the sine function we will use when we work with arcsine. And now clearly, if we now draw a horizontal line, it is definitely a function. So what we must understand now, that we don't confuse the inverse functions with our normal trigonometric functions that we did in the previous units, is that we only now work in the first quadrant for positive answers and in the fourth quadrant for negative answers. So we only have the two quadrants. So all our positive answers, we will give positive the reference angle. We will just give the reference angle as the answer. And if anything is negative, we will go to the fourth quadrant and we will give negative the reference angle as our answer. This is now very, very important. So we don't use the second and the third quadrant whatsoever for arcsine. Okay, so the first thing that you will have to be able to do is to draw the graph for us. And this is definitely going to be a question also in your test now. It's going to be a question now. We're going to ask you to draw the graph of arcsine and also to give us the domain and the range. So you will have to draw the graph plus give us the domain and the range. Now remember, we did inverse functions last semester, and remember the x and the y swap. So if we have pi over 2 here, it will be pi over 2 there. Minus pi over 2 here will be minus pi over 2 there, etc. We had the 1 here, it will now be 1 over there. We had negative 1 here, it will be now negative 1 over there. Okay, the x and the y swap. And then the other important thing, please make 100% sure when you draw the graph, that's your sine graph. Your inverse will be a reflection through the y is equal to x axis. In other words, your reflection will be that the graph must be shaped this way around. So this way around. So make sure that you draw it the correct. The graph must show the correct direction. And the curve must be bending in the correct way. So be careful that you don't draw the blue graph and then just use, minus pi over 2 and pi over 2 and minus 1 and 1 and whatever. And but you're actually drawing the blue graph. Because the blue graph is sine. The blue graph is not arcsine. So please make 100% sure of that. I also showed it here that you can see how it must bend. Okay, so basically, if we say that the sine of pi over 6 is a half, then we will say that the arc sine of the half must now be pi over 6. So it's just the inverse. So please make 100% sure that you understand that this is the angle. Give us then the value there. Oh, and this is now the value there, giving us back the angle here. Okay, we need to understand how we operating here. So if I ask you, what is arc sine a half? I'm actually asking you the angle. Arc always asks angle. So arc asks the angle. So if I say arc sine a half, my question is actually, which angle, if I take the sine of that angle, will give me a half? And we already said that should be pi over 6. So our answer should be pi over 6. Now, just be careful, because remember, you may only give answers in the first or the fourth quadrant. But remember, if we give the answer in the fourth quadrant, it must be negative the reference angle. In other words, we go clockwise there, and we go anti-clockwise there. So for the positive, we go anti-clockwise, and for negative, we go clockwise. That is very, very, very important. All right. So say now, I ask you, what is the arc sine of sine 2 pi over 3? Okay. Now the arc sine should cancel the sine, because they are each other's inverses. But now, 2 pi over 3 is in the second quadrant, and we may not give any answer in the second quadrant. But we know that sine is positive in this second quadrant. So therefore, we said all positive answers, we must give positive the reference angle. So therefore, our answer here will be positive the reference angle, and the reference angle is pi over 3, so our answer will be pi over 3. This is very important. Okay, so say now I ask you, what is the arc sine of sine 4 pi over 3? Right, so arc sine and sine will cancel one another. But now I need to give the answer in the correct quadrant. So I cannot say the answer is 4 pi over 3, except if it's in the correct quadrant. So where is 4 pi over 3? Well, that is in the third quadrant. That's over in the third quadrant. And their sign is negative. So if it's negative, I must give my answer as negative the reference angle. So therefore, my answer should be negative pi over 3. Negative pi over 3, because my reference angle here will be pi over 3, and I must give negative the reference angle as my answer. So now we have arc sine 11 pi over 6. So where is 11 pi over 6? Well, that is in the fourth quadrant. That's in the fourth quadrant. Their sign is negative. So once again, I must now give my answer as negative the reference angle. Well, the reference angle is pi over 6. So my answer here will be negative pi over 6. Okay, pause the video, go over this again and again, but this is very, very important that you understand this now. I know it's a new concept for you, but it's important that we must understand it. Okay, now, please look at the following now. Here we have sine and sine, sine and sine. And then we do what we just did now. Okay, but now here we have a cos and sine. In other words, two different functions. Now, if that is the case, then we put the bracket always equal to y. So we say let y be equal to the brackets. So, okay, so if y is equal then to arc sine 2 over 3, then we put a sine in front. Now remember, we actually put a sine in front of the y here, but then we must put a sine in front of the arc sine. And then the sine of the arc sine will cancel one another, and we will just have sine y is 2 over 3. Okay, and that is positive. So our drawing must now be in the first quadrant. So now we're back to what we did in the first unit. It's the same work, but we mustn't confuse the arc functions now with the normal functions. So we must just be very careful. Remember here, there's no second quadrant for sine, only 1 and 4. Right, so we will, because it's positive there, I just want to indicate there, because it's positive there, we need to make the drawing in the first quadrant. So sine is 2 over 3, which is the y over the r, so it's 2 over 3. Go to Pythagoras, work out the side that you need now, which is the x, and that is square root 5. And then what is the question? They actually want the cos. So now we just read the cos from our drawing, and the cos will be square root 5 over 3. So that will be our final answer. Okay, so let us look at this activity quickly. So arc sine negative a half. So which angle give a half? The reference angle should be pi over 6. But because it's negative, our answer must be negative the reference angle. So our answer is negative pi over 6. Okay, arc sine, sine. So the arc sine and the sine will cancel one another. But we must give our answer in the correct quadrant. So where is 3 pi over 4? Well, 3 pi over 4 is in the second quadrant. Their sine is positive. Therefore, I must give positive the reference angle, and therefore my answer will be pi over 4, because the reference angle is pi over 4. You can now see why I said in the recording about the reference angles, how important the reference angle is. Okay, so we must know that the reference angle here is just the pi over 4. And because it's positive, we must give positive the reference angle. So please do not confuse normal trigonometry with the arc functions. We need to understand exactly what is going on. Okay, here they just ask the value, not the angle. And because of that, we can just cancel, and the answer will be square root 3 over 2. So if we have the sine in the front and then the arc sine, we can just cancel. It's when we have arc sine in the front that we must be careful. Good. Here we have the two different functions. We said if we have two different functions, we take the bracket and put it equal to y. So y must be then the bracket. So we've got arc sine, so then we will put sine in front, and the sine will cancel the arc sine, and we just have square root 2 over 2. Well, this is a positive, so the drawing must be in the first quadrant. And then it's y over r, so work out your x with Pythagoras, and we see it's square root 2. Now what do they ask? They ask the cos. So just write now down the cos out of your drawing. The cos will be the x over the r, so it's square root 2 over 2. That's the final answer. Here again in number 5, we have a tan and an arc sine. Two different functions. So when we have two different functions, we put the bracket equal to y. So y must be arc sine negative 1 over square root 5. So I've got arc sine, so I'm going to put sine in front, and that will give me now negative 1 over square root 5, the sine, and the arc sine will cancel. Well, I've got negative. So for arc sine, where must I do the negatives? In the fourth quadrant. All positives in the first quadrant, all negatives in the fourth quadrant. So my drawing should be in the fourth quadrant. So there's my y and my r. use Pythagoras to work out the side that I need, which is x. I see x is 2. What do they ask? They ask the tan. So what is the tan? It's the y over the x. So my final answer should be minus 1 over 2. Okay, so I hope you understand how to handle the arc-sine function. In the next recording, we will now look at the arc-cos function.